Now we've got the founder of Zeteo News, Mehdi Hasan. Mehdi, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So I do want to get into a broader conversation about the media, about the election results, where we go from here. But first, I want to get your reaction to the allegations against Pete Hegseth and whether the pressure that he's feeling right now and that Trump is clearly feeling right now might suggest that perhaps Republicans aren't as immune to the whole Teflon Don of it all as this moment might suggest.
It's such a good question because I've thought long and hard about the Trump era and what Trump gets away with. And one of the only silver linings of all the dark clouds of this era is that he is sui generis, Trump. There doesn't seem to be anyone else like him. No one else,
Right.
even in his close orbit, can get away with the kind of crap that he gets away with. So we have this whole issue of Matt Gaetz accused of, child sex trafficking or whatever it is, which he denies. You have Peter Hegseth accused of rape. But hold on. The guy appointing them was found liable for sexual abuse, what a judge said could be called rape, by a jury of his peers in New York. So the whole thing is absurd, right? If you think about it, who is Trump to sit as any kind of judge, jury, executioner of his cabinet? But that's the world we're in. Trump gets a pass. He's been elected. The public don't care. But they do seem to care about cabinet officials. The media do seem to care. It's been a feeding frenzy since he's nominated all these people. The Hegseth stuff gets worse by the day. He had his mother come out to defend him on Fox, where else, his old channel, this morning. Yeah. I love the idea that we're going to be strong in the world and have this strong defense secretary who's going to go up against China and Russia. But he needs mommy to come help him on TV. Right. The same mother who, by the way, wrote an email to him saying, apologize, demanding accountability on behalf of all women. He said many women, she said, who he had abused in some shape or form. She's now taken that back. Surprise, surprise. But not just that. There's the allegations of rape. There's the stuff about his own views. My colleague Prem Thakur at Zeteo just published a piece last night going through 4 of his books. And some of the stuff he said about women in the military, abortion rights, Muslims, immigrants. You just go down the list. Israel, America's role in the world. He's a real hawk, pretending now to be this kind of peacenik anti-war guy like Trump. He's a hardcore neocon. So look, there's a lot going on. I think you put your finger on it by saying, can the others get away with what Trump gets away with? We're now hearing reporting from the Wall Street Journal that he might swap him for DeSantis, which is hilarious because Trump suggested Ron DeSantis grooms young girls.
And it was also Trump himself who branded Ron DeSantis Tiny D. So you brand this guy Tiny D, and now you want to put him in charge of the Pentagon and 1.3 million active duty troops? I mean, talk about undermining your own case. But Mehdi, more broadly, does this suggest that maybe in a post-Trump Republican Party that we might revert back to the mean here, and it might not feel like the same Trump party if they recognize that they can't get away with all the shit that Donald Trump gets away with?
So I think halfway I agree with that. I'll tell you the 50% I agree with is yes, they will realize that they can't get away with what Trump gets away with. Only Trump can get away with what Trump's gotten away with in terms of personal morality or lack thereof, and all of the other stuff. Having said that, one thing I do worry about is Gaetz went because of his personal shit. Hegseth may go because of his personal shit. But what about the others who don't have personal shit, but are actually scarier, more dangerous in many ways?
Right. It's their politics. It's not their past. It's their politics.
Kash Patel being a classic example of it. We don't know what Kash Patel's private life is like. I don't really want to know what Kash Patel's private life is like. But we do know what he said on the record. We do know that he said he's going to go after the media. We do know that what he said he's going to do to the FBI. We do know what he said he's going to do to his political opponents, right? We do know he's a sycophant and a bag carrier for Trump, who will allow Trump to use the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a political weapon. That's all there. And Kash Patel probably has the vote unless kind of Murkowski, Collins, McConnell can stop him. So that's what I'm worried about. Yes, I get the personal stuff still clearly does, derail nominations even in 2024. But what about the non-personal stuff? By the way, there's one character, RFK Jr., who's got the personal stuff and the policy stuff, both of which are equally crazily bad.
Mehdi, I want to talk a little bit about the media right now. So you run an independent media company. What do you think is the state of independent media on the left right now?
I mean, we're doing well, but as a big picture, it's not great compared to the right. One of the reasons, Brian, and you know this because you and I talked earlier in the year, one of the reasons I set up Zeteo back in February, March, April, was because I left MSNBC and I saw there was this gap in the market. The people on the right, whether it's your Tucker Carlson, whether it's your Megyn Kelly, whether it's your Barry Weiss, Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire, are monetizing their right-wing outrage politics and grievance mongering and are building huge audiences online, paying audiences online with subscription business models. And I was looking around at the left and think no one's really doing it on the left. You've had huge success on YouTube. You crossed 3 million subscribers. Congratulations. But you're not running a subscription business. And it hasn't, and we know that Cenk and the Young Turks have been on YouTube for a while. And there's been attempts to do things on the left. And just narrowing down to the subscription model, no one had really tried to do a subscription model. We've tried to do it. I think we're doing a good job. We just crossed 300,000 subscribers globally in 8 months. We're very pleased with that. We're making some good money off subscriptions. We have over 40,000 paid subscribers. I saw that gap in the market from a purely commercial business point, but also from an ideological point of view. Why aren't more people doing this on the left, given the left in the mainstream media it's kind of non-existing. MSNBC, where I used to work, is not left-wing. People get annoyed when I point this out. It's not, right? It's kind of at best center-left. It's kind of at best centrist liberal. It's not supporting the kind of causes that the left cares about. And that's a problem. And the same with the New York Times, the same with the Washington Post. The conservatives have so successfully branded all mainstream media as liberal left that actually there hasn't been a real space for actual liberals and lefties to go, well, these are our offerings in an independent
right, because they're so afraid of being branded as liberal that they have to overcompensate to prove that in fact they're not.
Yes. And that then follows through into independent media, because then you're like, well, why do we need all this independent media? You already have the New York Times and MSNBC. No, they're not. Like my politics, the tails are very different to New York Times and MSNBC. Yeah. So I think, look, to answer your question, it's not in a great shape because financially the support hasn't been there, either from ordinary people being willing to put their hand in their pocket and say, I'm going to subscribe. I'm going to value the content that Brian does or Mehdi does or whoever else does. And also from the big investors, the big donors, the big money folks. I mean, it's a truism, but we got to point this out. Like right-wing media is catering to wealthy people. So it's easy for them to raise money off of wealthy people,
Correct.
Right? Left-wing media is saying, hey, let's have some more regulation, a bit bigger government, higher taxes on the wealthy. That doesn't naturally attract a lot of people outside of the Soroses of this world. So it is an issue when it comes to funding. When it comes, I mean, we've been very lucky. I raised $4 million from kind of friends and family around, and from people, interested parties, small business people who wanted to support the mission. But I didn't go big. But people who do want to go big, it's much easier on the right. I mean, Ben Shapiro turns up and says to a fracking magnate in Texas, "Give me $4 million to launch," and that's how Daily Wire launches.
Totally. Well, okay. So that's the money perspective from the left-wing independent media. But what about Democratic politicians? Because there is an onus. I think the right has been really successful and really effective at getting their politicians, their elected officials, to lay hands on right-wing media so that they can then prop them up and allow those people to act as emissaries for the right-wing mission. We don't have, or we haven't had for a very, very long time, anything like that on the left, because I think the left, wrongly, to your point, for exactly the reason that we were talking about before, views mainstream media as their message distribution system, notwithstanding the fact that mainstream media is bending over backwards to prove that it is not an arm of the Democratic Party in anywhere close to the same way that right-wing media is an arm of the Republican
100%.
Party, exists to serve as a propaganda arm of the GOP. So do you think that there's some acknowledgement now about where they went wrong and that we'll move toward a world where Democratic politicians, Democratic elected officials are going to embrace independent media, recognizing that we need them to close the gap, the asymmetry that exists in our media ecosystem?
So I think you answered your own question. It's the asymmetry is the issue. It's the inability of the left-wing media, which is a good thing, to act as a propaganda arm for a political party in the way that the right does. I mean, the right has a very specific model, right? It is propaganda, from Fox down to the Daily Wire, down to your independent, YouTubers. It is very much propaganda, and people don't like saying this because they think there's a both sides. No, I have my criticism of MSNBC. I worked there for 3 years. I have my praise for MSNBC. I worked there 3 years. But one thing that annoys me when people go, well, the left has MSNBC and the right has Fox. They're not the same thing, right? They're just not. MSNBC does not. Whatever. I know it's going to sound crazy to right-wingers who may come across your YouTube channel, Brian, but MSNBC does not act as a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party. I know that because I used to work there, right? Sean Hannity called Trump every night of his presidency.
He was on stage with him at rallies.
Rachel Maddow did not call
stage.
Joe Biden up every night to chat to him and act as a de facto chief of staff. No matter, I'm not saying they're not pro-democratic. Of course they are. But it's not the same propaganda. They'll still cover the news. Fox wouldn't even cover Hegseth till today. They didn't cover anything to do with Peter Hegseth. It's not a news network, so we should stop calling it Fox News. But to go back to your broader question about Democratic politicians. So there's two things here. Number one, they are to blame partly, as you say, for not propping up a left-wing space and treating the ABCs and NBCs as, well, that's our message distribution platform. Big mistake. I 100% agree with you on that. And I wouldn't just say Democrats, mainstream Democrats. Bernie, as someone who's criticized the mainstream media, has not supported left-wing media. Cenk Uygur did a great monologue the other day I saw on my social media where he was saying, Bernie's right to come out and say we need a new working class vehicle, we need an alternative to the mainstream Democrat. But he's not done anything to build it up. Bernie Sanders loves mainstream media. He's always on the Sunday shows. Will he do an interview with me? Very rarely, even though I'm probably the only cable host between 2020 and 2023 who would endorse Bernie Sanders, who had a show on cable, never came on my show. So that was a problem. And I think you've had the same problem with a lot of mainstream Democratic Party leaders who you have a huge audience, but they'd much rather go on a Sunday morning show, which has way fewer viewers than you do. So I think that's one problem, is that they just are not smart enough, savvy enough to see the opportunities here. They're very old school, very conventional, very cautious. The one thing I always say about liberals, it's not about the ideology, it's about the mindset of caution that permeates the entire movement. Yes. And then number two, I think there is something we should be proud of, which is one of the reasons they don't just want to turn up on left independent media is because we're not propaganda arms, right? Even if you are pro-Democratic Party, as you clearly are, you don't deny that. If Robert Menendez came on your show, you would ask him about the gold bars, right?
Correct.
But the equivalent of Robert Menendez turns up on Newsmax, they won't. And I think that's the problem, right? Fundamentally, is that comes back to the reality-based universe. At the end of the day, no matter what our biases are, no matter what MSNBC's politics are, people on the liberal left are still going to live in a reality-based universe, still going to try and do the basics of journalism, no matter what our personal opinions are. That's gone on the right. I mean, we saw that, and that's not my opinion. That's fact, right? Fox went and settled the Dominion case, proving that they're not a news network.
Mehdi, you had said something that really caught my eye, and that was this idea of a mindset of caution among Democrats. This election was in large part a referendum on I think the authenticity and relatability in their politicians. I mean, you have somebody like Trump who objectively has much lower threshold for caution than somebody like Kamala Harris does. And I think that we're seeing that more broadly in the kind of media figures that are promoted on the right versus the media figures that are promoted on the left. There is a degree of like throwing caution to the wind. Of course, that's all on a backdrop of, pushing back against political correctness. And so inherently, you're going to have more of that on the right anyway. But do you think that this election is going to kind of reverse the Democrats' embrace of caution that we've seen, from the days of Hillary Clinton all the way to this campaign, which, was probably less willing to go on certain shows because it would pose some risks?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you dated it back to Hillary Clinton, because Barack Obama was actually a very cautious president. But when he campaigned, he wasn't cautious. I've always found the interesting dichotomy. When you talk about Obama, you have to divide between the campaigner, the candidate Obama, and the president Obama. Obama as a president was super cautious, too cautious for my liking. But as a campaigner, if you remember 2012, he didn't run as an incumbent. He ran almost as an insurgent and portrayed Mitt Romney as the establishment capitalist Bane guy who had to be stopped. Democrats haven't run like that for a long time, as Obama ran in 2008 or even 12. Hillary didn't run like that. And Joe Biden certainly this year, before he pulled out, wasn't running like that. And Kamala Harris, with her Uber brother-in-law, didn't run like that. And I think why I'm pessimistic about whether Democrats are going to embrace kind of boldness and drop some of their caution is twofold. Number one, we've seen no evidence of it since Election Day. We've seen Fluff and all at Qatar and all the team of advisors around Harris doing the Pod Save America interview, doing the Atlantic Ron Brownstein interview, and basically saying we got nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong. We're not contrite. We have no apologies. We'd do it all the same. And the worst part of these interviews they've been doing, these postmortems, is they keep going, well, you have to understand, we inherited a really bad situation. The internal polling was really bad. Joe Biden was more unpopular than even you knew. So why the F did you not break with Biden then? As some of us said, it actually makes it even worse for them not breaking with Biden by them now admitting that they knew he was more unpopular than the public knew. Because then the arguments were, oh, well, we can't break with the sitting president. You can if your internal polling is telling you that he is toxic and pulling you down. So that's right. Number one. I don't see them going bold when even in their postmortems, they're not willing to accept what they did wrong. And number two, it's a personnel thing, Brian, right? Until you are able to change the pundit class, the consultant class, and of course, the actual members of Congress, you're not going to be able to have people willing to take chances. When I look at people like someone like a Greg Kasar in Austin. I like him not just because I share his politics and because he's a member of the squad. I like AOC not just because she shares my politics. Clearly, we have similar politics. Why I like these kind of politicians is because of their approach to messaging. Their approach to politics is not to take shit from anyone, is to go out there, take risks, test out messages, right? That until you have more politicians willing to do that within the Democratic Party who aren't just willing to turn up, play it safe, keep their heads down, that's going to be a problem going forward.
Well, I think one thing from that interview, from the Pod Save America Kamala leadership interview, that I think did actually suggest that there was something that needs to change within the Democratic Party is Quentin Fawkes said that there's a lot of apologizing happening and tiptoeing around certain special interest groups and making sure that they don't say anything that they would then have to, turn around 5 minutes later for and apologize and get on the phone and explain to these people. And that does, I think, present itself or manifest itself in a way where then the campaigns are a little bit more cautious because, the Democratic Party is a Big Tent party, but we're also the party that's going to stand up and protect trans people and is going to protect special interest groups. And so I think the way that we're seeing that now is that has manifested in more of a desire to be, or a need.
But Brian, let me push back a bit.
To be careful.
The reason they didn't come out more economically populist is not because of some pressure group. It's probably more, and we can't prove this, but from the reporting, it's people like Tony Harris, her brother-in-law from Uber, who were telling her, tone down the stuff, stop bashing big business, right? And who knows what Plouffe was saying. And the problem is, that's what it comes down to. I mean, I hear all this analysis and the Adam Gentleson piece in the New York Times, the groups, the special interest, the pressure groups, the activists. Fundamentally, though, Hillary, Joe, Kamala, they weren't listening to those groups as their number one, sounding board in the morning every day. They were listening to donors. They were listening to pundits. They were listening to consultants. And I think that's where the problem lies in the Democratic Party right now, fundamentally.
With that said, then, do you think that there is going to be a higher threshold for dissent within the Democratic Party? I know that basically we're in a moment right now where you have a lot of, the more moderate Democrats who are saying that progressivism was the problem, and they can point to the fact that Jared Golden won his district and ran far ahead of Kamala. They can point to the fact that Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez ran far ahead of Kamala. But then progressives to the same point can say, look, Kamala ran a campaign where she had Liz Cheney on the campaign trail in more instances than she did embrace progressivism at the end. So what do you think that the Democrats do moving forward in terms of figuring out where they're going to, I guess, whether the party tacks right or whether the party tacks left?
But that's the problem. I don't think it's about going right or left. I think it's about whether you're going to have a fight or whether you're not going to have a fight. And this is what I've said for a while. Like, I like Congress members like Eric Swalwell, not because he and I are on the same page ideologically. He's way to my right. But I like Swalwell because he has a fight. Because he knows who the enemy are. He knows how to make the case. You mentioned Jared Golden and Maria Gluesenkamp-Perez. Yeah, I don't share their politics. They're definitely to the right of me. But did they run right-wing campaigns or did they run populist, authentic campaigns?
Correct. Yeah.
Did they say right to repair in her case? Anti-monopoly in his case? All right. This is what we need to be talking about right now. It's not about whether you sign a tick box of I'm left, I'm right, I do these policies. It's about who are you fighting for? Do you have a fighting spirit? Do people know what you stand for? Are you authentic, or are you just a kind of poll-tested, focus group-tested, bland person who no one thinks is going to fight for them in Washington, D.C.?
Right. I mean, in large part, this was, strangely enough, it did feel like a referendum. I mean, you even hear somebody like Cenk come out and say that this election result is the result of the establishment losing and more of the anti-establishment forces winning. And so moving forward, I mean, Democrats don't generally nominate for their party standard bearer somebody who is anti-establishment, because by saying we have to protect our institutions, we have to protect our democracy, for so many people out there for whom democracy and our institutions isn't working, that is not the message they want to hear. That is the message that's going to push them away. And so how do we take that into account in our candidates moving forward for a party that, look, in one wing, wants somebody like Joe Biden, who is as establishment as it gets. He's been in politics for 50 years. But by that same token, we're missing out on a broad swath of people for whom the establishment and democracy and our institutions is actually the polar opposite of what they're looking for, and somebody that and something that they won't pull the lever for in the ballot box.
I think you put your finger on it, where defending democracy in abstract is fine, but when you're defending institutions that people hate for good reason in many cases, nobody wants to go to the mat for the Senate, right? Like it's just right. No. And the polling shows the American public are not happy with the state of democracy in this country, not just in terms of Trump undermining democracy, but how democracy works itself. Campaign finance reform, money in politics, all of this stuff, minority rule, gerrymandering, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, during the campaign, one of the big mistakes, and people are going to laugh at me because it sounds so niche, but I actually think it was symbolic. First, they buried Tim Walz, who I thought was a great addition to the team. I preferred him over Shapiro, but now it's fashionable to say, well, he cost our votes. Actually, I think they wasted Walz, right? They picked him and then they silenced him. He was doing a great job with the weird attacks when they were polling highly, and then suddenly they stopped saying weird, and they put Walz, put him under a blanket and hid him away. And then when he does come out and go, you know what, we should get rid of the Electoral College, hugely popular idea with the American public across the board, Republicans and Democrats don't like the Electoral College. The Harris team disowned it, slapped him down and said, no, he wasn't speaking for us. So there's just an example of one way where you talk about institutions. Nobody likes the Electoral College. Democrats should not associate themselves with the Electoral College. In terms of the broader point about anti-establishment candidates, you're right to go back. And actually, I would argue, if you take Joe Biden and the COVID election 2020 out of the picture, yeah, you do go back and you see they pick establishment people like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and they lose, and Al Gore. And they pick Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who are Washington outsiders in the eyes of many people, and they win, right? So I do think that, it's correlation, not causation, but I do think there is worth having a conversation about who are the right candidates going forward, given we failed. That's what the Democrats should be asking with. We failed with the Hillarys and the Bidens and the Harrises and the Kerrys. Who can we have? I don't know who that person is, by the way. As people are doing horse race stuff, runners and riders for 2028. I don't know who that person is who has that authenticity. Because as much as I think Whitmer and Newsom are solid candidates and Shapiro, and they're all going to be in the mix, I don't think any of them could go on Joe Rogan. If the Joe Rogan test is now the test, people are like, Kamala Harris should have gone on Joe Rogan. I'm glad she didn't go on Joe Rogan. It would have been a disaster. From everything we've seen from Harris's performance, she would not have been authentic. She would have not have had answers to basic questions like how you're different to Joe Biden. She would not have been able to connect with his audience. So I'm actually think it's a good thing. For whatever reason, whoever you blame, she didn't go on Rogan. It would have been car crash TV. But the question is, who can go on a Joe Rogan? And I use Joe Rogan more broadly. Who can go on shows who speak freely, where you talk in an authentic manner? Why did people love Bernie during the primaries in 16 and 20? Because he spoke in authentic fashion. Who is the Democratic version of John McCain 2000, right? McCain, the maverick image, the bus, the talking to reporters freely without, being controlled by consultants, making corruption and anti-establishment your actual guiding spirit. And I think that could be a model as well. Again, it's not about left-right. I don't agree with John McCain's 2000 campaign in its substance, but in its tone and focus, that's the kind of campaign Democrats should be running.
Yeah, and the irony of that is that we have spent so much time fostering a bench, but a bench that is more establishment, does feel more political. I mean, look, I get it. Like I was a big Elizabeth Warren supporter. Her whole thing was plans. This is somebody who is a legislator, and for a lot of Democrats, I feel like that is what's attractive to us. But at the same time, again, we're in a moment right now where I think people are just so starved for authenticity, especially in the political space, because let's be honest, they've gotten fucked by politicians for so long.
Brian, I said this in 2017, well before the Warren, Bernie, Biden primaries in 2020. When Trump won in 2016, I said to a friend of mine, and I don't know if I said this publicly, but I think I may have joked it publicly, the next Democratic person who runs for president shouldn't do Hillary Clinton's, here's my 24-page childcare plan, fully costed proposals. And you remember, Kamala Harris got hit a lot, unfairly in my view, for not having enough plans, even though she had way more than Trump, who couldn't even come up with a healthcare plan in 2 weeks, his famous 2-week deadline. But I do think, I'm only half joking when I say the next Democratic candidate should say, I'm going to give you all a $30 minimum wage. And when the reporters say, well, how are you going to do that? Just wait and see. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Seriously, I mean, why the fuck
You're
not?
right, though. I mean,
why the fuck
you're
not?
right.
If Trump can go and say, I'm going to build a beautiful wall, I'm going to give you the best healthcare, but never give you details. I think at some point you got to fight fire with fire. And Carl Kalinske, who I know you know, another independent left broadcaster, he's been saying that for a while. It's not about establishment, anti-establishment, left, right. You just need a fighter who's super confident and doesn't give a shit.
Right. I mean, part of the thing that holds us back, I feel like, is that we feel like the way that the media holds Democrats to a different standard than Republicans, we validate that by virtue of continuing to humor them. I mean, like
But
that's the asymmetry. The asymmetry is there and it
I
persists.
don't think you can underestimate the damage that was done to Harris during that period where A, she wouldn't do an interview, where the media got obsessed with her not doing it, which she probably should have done. And B, the whole policy thing, where it became like a meme, lazy talking point from DC journalists, like, where are her plans? Where are her policies? She hasn't laid out. She copied and pasted from Biden. It's like, whatever she has is 100 times better than what Donald Trump is offering, right? But that did a lot of damage. So the next Democratic president has to be ready for all that, has to have a plan for the media. Because Biden didn't have one by avoiding press conferences. Harris didn't have one by avoiding interviews. Trump had his own plan, which is I'm going to avoid everyone, and even in Fox, and just do podcasts, which worked for him. I'm not saying that's replicable, but there has to be some strategy for the media environment. Because look, one thing that's really bothering me, and you know this because I've told you this many times, when people say, well, the real reason they lost the election is incumbency. Biden was a very unpopular president, and the economy was really, viewed negatively. And no one steps back and goes, but why? Because the Republicans successfully over 4 years convinced people that the economy was better under Trump. It wasn't. They convinced people that we're in the middle of a recession. We're not. And they convinced people that Joe Biden's the worst president ever. And he wasn't, right? So this is the problem. I have my own issues with Joe Biden. My criticism on Gaza will never go away. I think that's a stain on his record and will define his presidency. And actually, from an electoral point of view, also screwed the Democrats, but a conversation for another day. But my point being, up until, let's say, the summer of 2023, pre-Gaza, pre-October 7th, when you're looking at his domestic record, it was a very, very strong domestic record, but people didn't know about it or didn't believe it. Yeah. And that's what Democrats need to be post-mortem around. How did we produce such an amazing economy? How do we get so much shit done? Going back to LBJ, no president's got this much shit done. We got zero credit for it. I don't hear people actually discussing that. For me, that's at the core of this.
And to kind of bolster that exact point, I mean, the minute that Donald Trump was elected, we then saw consumer sentiment flip. And so, now we're at a point where
he's also going to get
Republicans
credit,
think
Brian,
that the economy
for
is doing well.
All of these infrastructure projects that happen on his watch, all of these Medicare pricing deals that happen on his watch, he's going to be taking credit for it all.
And in large part, I mean, that is the benefit. That right there is the benefit distilled into having a right-wing media ecosystem that acts as a hermetically sealed bubble. And so I guess the worry for me is when we move forward in a media environment where you can do the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the PACT Act, the gun safety law, the infrastructure law, add 16 million jobs, bring the unemployment rate down to a 50-year low, the stock market up to a record high, and where the vast majority of Americans still think that the economy is terrible, that right there is the benefit of having a right-wing media ecosystem that exists to serve the Republican Party and also puts on full display the need to have something to counter that so that we're not in an environment where suddenly it doesn't matter what Democrats do, they're always just going to get hit for doing the complete opposite.
Yeah, and the problem is, of course, there was a big debate, you remember, on the left, where John Favreau and I had this conversation, Chris Hayes and I had this conversation, what do you do as a center-left politician running for re-election on a record that's good economically in the big terms, but in a country where
people still hurting?
And do you want there's a whole debate about, are you tone deaf? I remember Hillary was attacked for saying, we don't need to make America great again. America is great. And people said, well, that didn't resonate with people because people are suffering. And I think that is a real problem because Democrats are like, well, do I run on what you just said? Amazing 50-year unemployment low, stock market at a high, growth at a high, blah, blah, blah. But then people are like, well, hold on, but I'm struggling paycheck to paycheck. Hold on, I have a friend who, whatever. Or do you go, I hear your pain, we need to do more, which is the Bernie argument, but then you're actually not running on your record. It's not, there's no easy answer. I just want to be fair. I bash Democrats a lot. But that's not an easy plan. The Democratic Party is not Trump. Trump shamelessly will just run on, it's the greatest economy in the world. I'm the greatest president in the world. We've never had growth so good. Democrats aren't going to do that. Democrats and the media still live in a reality-based universe where they're going to say stuff like, well, yes, the economy is doing really well. Yes, we're the fastest growing economy in the G7. Yes, we have the lowest unemployment 50, but inflation's really bad. And then Democrats say, yes, we acknowledge that. Trump would never acknowledge that, right? In his presidency now, things are going to go bad. You think Trump and his team are going to sit around going, well, we need to kind of acknowledge American voters' pain. We need to reach out and say, we get it. They're not going to do that. And they won't be expected to do that because they're graded on a curve.
And you're right that it's not an easy answer. And I think that if we look to the Biden administration, I think very much aligned with the Obama administration, there is a glaring lack of willingness to beat our chest about our wins because we don't want to seem tone deaf in the face of so many Americans out there suffering. But you look at what Trump has done to the same point, and he can wake up in the morning and tie his shoes correctly, and they'll throw a parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. And so there has to be, and I don't know the answer either. And I don't know the answer to this either, but I do know that what we're doing right now ain't it. Mehdi, I do want to talk about the impact because you had brought this up about Israel-Gaza and whether you think in an election where we did see such a pronounced swing to the right, but all across the country, to what extent you thought that the situation, the war in Gaza had an impact on Kamala's loss. And I ask this because look, we saw swings, we saw swings in Michigan, but at the same time, we saw commensurate swings down in Alabama, over in Utah. And so how do you kind of think about this?
It's a great question. I've been thinking about it. I think there's many layers to this, and I'll just keep it very simple. And I've actually changed my position a bit on this, Brian. So after the election, when I saw those swings, I said to a few friends of mine, including Muslim friends of mine, I don't think you can say Gaza made a difference this way or that way. She lost so badly, so across the board, so across every demographic that you can't just say it was Arab Americans in, Dearborn, Michigan, or whatever it is that swung it. I've actually changed my position a bit for two reasons. Number one, I do think Gaza was actually bigger than I thought it was. And I'll tell you why. Number one, look at the narrowness of the Rust Belt states, right? You can talk about national trends, great, but we all know national trends are irrelevant to who wins or loses. For Harris to win this election, all she had to do was win Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Trump won those states by 230,000 votes, ballpark, right? Across those three states. So if 115 or 116,000 votes had switched from Trump to Harris, she would be president. She wouldn't have won the popular vote. It would have been a great irony. The Democrats would have won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. Republicans would be screaming about the Electoral College. But she would be president-elect right now if 115,000 switched from Trump. It was very, very narrow. Now, in that kind of narrowness, in those kind of Rust Belt states, I'm going to say, in a place like Michigan, she clearly could have won Michigan when it was that narrow, had she given something to the people there, some kind of hope, some kind of change on an issue that was central to their very existence. They were losing family members by the day in places like Gaza and Lebanon. So I do think it played a big role in some of those swing states, clearly not national. And number two, it's not about Gaza, the policy. Let's say you're not someone who pays attention to the Middle East. You're not someone who cares about the fate of Israelis or Palestinians, and you live in one of these swing states. You know what Gaza means? It doesn't mean a policy issue. It means change. Harris, just by switching on Gaza, would have showed she wasn't Joe Biden, right? That was one of the many areas where people were asking, well, where are you going to be different to Biden? And she couldn't answer the question. In fact, she doubled down on Biden policies on the Middle East. So even if you don't care about Gaza as a substantive topic, as a policy area, just the symbolism of her coming out and saying, I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to actually criticize Netanyahu publicly. I'm going to suggest that I'm going to enforce the law when I'm president on arms sales. Just that would have had an impact on the general tenor of her campaign, which was no change. I'm going to be the same as Biden. So I do think it played a big role, both directly in those swing states with those key voters and indirectly in terms of a big picture image in a very close election, a change election.
Mehdi, we'd spoken about the asymmetry in the media and Democrats being graded on a curve while Donald Trump kind of gets a pass. Trump had signaled in the campaign where his stance was on Israel versus Gaza. And now that he's in office, he's appointed, pro-Israel hawks to his cabinet between Marco Rubio, Elise Stefanik. And so can you explain why Kamala Harris took the brunt of the blame when it comes to Israel-Gaza, but Trump, who is either the same or worse, why he gets a pass, or why so many Arab American voters swung toward him?
And I think, a couple of things. One is I hear this all the time, and I understand why a lot of liberals, white liberals who don't follow this issue closely, are confused. Right? I get it.
Yeah.
And just factually, just be clear, he did win in Dearborn, but overall, according to the Fox exit poll, 65% of Muslim Americans voted for Harris. The majority, the Jews and Muslims voted Democrat. The only religious group that voted majority in every sect, Trump, was Christians. Christians voted for Trump in every type of Christian group voted Trump, super majority, except for Catholics who were just a simple majority. So it slightly frustrates me when I see people saying, "Oh, Muslims did not vote for Trump. The majority of Muslims voted Democratic." Now, did he get a swing? Yeah, like he did in every demographic. And did in places like Dearborn, clearly they went for him because of Gaza? Yes. And the simple answer is, people don't play counterfactuals. Voters don't do that. They base it on what's happening in the here and now. And in the here and now, Joe Biden was president, Kamala Harris was vice president, and 42,000 people were killed on their watch with American weapons. And they showed very little empathy and very little support for these people. And I think that is fundamental. So when I said to people, I said what you said, Brian. I spoke to Muslim crowds in Philadelphia, in swing states. And I said, Trump's worse. And they very legitimately said, maybe he is, maybe he's not. We'll find that out. Right now, today, Biden's the one who's allowing our people to be killed. And I think that's a problem the Democrats have to recognize. And the funny thing is, the bar was so low. People here who've lost family members were not asking for Joe Biden to take Benjamin Netanyahu to the International Criminal Court to be punished. They were just saying, number one, feel our pain. Just have some empathy. You're supposed to be the empathy president. He didn't, Biden. Number two, just criticize Israel publicly like you would any other country. Like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are criticizing Israel. Why couldn't Joe Biden? And number three, on the policy front, if you're not going to do an arms embargo, at least talk about the importance of international law, American law. Kamala Harris ran as a prosecutor. All she had to say was, of course, I support the president of the United States. I'm not undermining Joe Biden, but when I'm president, I'm going to enforce the law. That's all she had to say. Enforce the law, because our arms sales to Israel are a violation of American law. They're a violation of the Leahy Act. They're a violation of the Foreign Assistance Act. That's all she had to say. The bar was so low. People were not asking for that much. They were asking for just the bare minimum. And that Harris and Biden couldn't give them the bare minimum is both a moral outrage and electoral insanity.
Yeah, I think that's such a good answer, such a smart answer in terms of how voters operate. And I think that we saw that not just with Israel-Gaza, but the economy as well. People are looking at what's right in front of them. They're not doing counterfactuals. They're not imagining, okay, based on the policies that are laid out by another candidate. In large part, this election was also a referendum on high prices and on inflation, and people are just looking at who's in office and looking to punish them. And they're not thinking about the past or the future. They're looking at the moment that they're in right now.
It was very much a punishment election, both on inflation, on what they perceive to be the border failures, and of course on Gaza for a faction of people. And people don't realize that sometimes voting, a lot of pundits and politicians see voting is very rational, it's very empirical. No, it's not here, it's here. And a lot of people are just voting, as you say, punishment. They just want to throw the bastards out. Like, that is fundamentally what voting is for a lot of people. And that's why the anti-incumbency effect is so strong. Although we've never seen it like this in our lifetimes. We've now had 3 elections in a row for the first time in modern American history where the sitting president has been thrown out.
Yeah. Mehdi, we had spoken a lot about the media. How can watchers and listeners support you guys at Zeteo News?
Well, Zeteo is right behind me. It's a funny spelling. It's an old ancient Greek word which means to seek out the truth. Zeteo.com is where you can go to subscribe. We're on Substack there. We're on YouTube. We don't have your numbers yet on YouTube, but we're trying. Join our 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. Join our 300,000 subscribers at Zeteo. Try and become a paid subscriber so you can support the work that me and Brian and other independent journalists do, because, as I keep saying, a free press isn't free.
Well, Mehdi, I couldn't give you higher praise for the work that you are doing, so thank you so much for taking the time. For those who are watching right now, I'll put the link to Zeteo in the post description if you're watching on YouTube, and in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast. Mehdi, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, my friend.